This right here is a $13,000 engine, and that's just to purchase the engine alone. So if you're running around in an old ragtop clapped out Seabiscuit and you're interested in the idea of what the process is to replace the old unreliable, then this is the video for you. Now, many of you have watched us remove an old engine and put on some new engines a few times over the years, but we've never really discussed what you get, what you don't get, and what the whole process really costs to do. We've got a playlist up here at the top that's got all the videos that relates to this repower topic, so today we'll dive more into the details of that process. You've got like 3 different stages, or I guess you could say 3 levels of different repower options based on what you need or what you want to get done. The first one would be just a simple engine swap or a repower without the rigging, where you've got a boat with a certain brand engine on it and you just pull that engine off and put a new one back on without having to change out anything else. Then the second one is going to be when you've got a certain brand or type of engine on the boat and you repower with a new engine plus all new rigging. This is typically when you go from, say, mechanical controls to a fly-by-wire or electronically controlled system, or when you switch from one brand of an engine to another that requires you to have to change out all the rigging from the old brand to the new brand. Then finally, your third option is going to be a repower, whether that be with or without the rigging, but you've also got a bunch of what you could call add-ons that you want to get done at the same time. This is when you do a repower of the engine and at the same time you change out wiring, lights, add new electronics, a new stereo system, or anything else like that, which is going to put more time onto the job than there would be without these add-ons, which is ultimately and more importantly going to change the price and the cost of the project. But we won't tackle that issue just yet though. Now, we've already covered what is included with a new engine in a separate video, so make sure you check out that video playlist later for all of those components. But your first repower option is the simplest option, though it might not always even be an option depending on your situation, where you are just going to be removing the old engine and putting a new engine on. Now, when it comes to the cost of these projects, just like we did with the fuel tank process, we'll build out the price based on how long it will take to get done, which will allow you to narrow down what it will cost for you, because time, tools, and skill sets can vary between different people.
It ain't got no gas in it.
And so the cost can vary based on who is going to be doing the work, changing up the price for each one of you individually. So when you are just pulling an engine off and putting a new one on, you've got to account for the entire process, for getting rid of the old engine or knowing what you are going to do with it, where you are going to store it or how you will transport it, as well as having all of your parts and tools there and ready, having sealant, your drill, a drill bit to clean out the holes when you get the bolts out, having cleaner there to clean up the surface before installing the new engine. Then it's just a matter of de-rigging the engine and pulling out the 4 bolts, yanking the engine off the boat, and once it's off, you'll account for cleaning up the transom, unpackaging the new engine, and then bolting it onto the boat. Once it's bolted on, you've got to rig it, hook up the steering system to the engine, and perform a PDI or pre-delivery inspection that we covered in that playlist of videos, which goes over checking and topping off all the engine oil, the gear lube, putting the prop on, and those kinds of things. So once it's all accounted for, you are going to be looking at anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, and in some extreme cases, maybe up to 8 hours of work, with some of that time including having a second person there to help you, depending on the size of the engine, the access to the mounting bolts, and everything else like that. Obviously, swapping out a 25 horsepower engine is going to be way quicker than swapping out a 350 horsepower engine. Now, one kicker to that number though is it will kind of stay at that 4-hour mark per engine, even as you add on engines in those bigger engine applications. So with everything running smoothly, you've got 4 hours for one engine, 8 hours for 2 engines, 12 hours for 3 engines, and 16 hours for 4 engines. Even though with a good crew and everything running smoothly, you can swap out 4 engines in roughly 1 day. But that's 2 people working together all day, giving you that total of 16 hours of work. Keep in mind this is a plus or minus type of number too, where you can add a couple of hours or take away a couple of hours for all the different kinds of variables that can happen while working on a boat. So you might be able to get 2 engines off and on in 6 hours, or it might take that full 8 hours. The same goes with the 4 engines. You might take 18 hours or so to get the 4 off and on, but this gives you a general idea of the time frame that it takes for something like this. Now when we move on to the second repower option, where we have to get into dealing with the rigging as well as the engine, we're going to start with the base number of 4 hours per engine for the rigging. But now we've got to throw in some serious variables into the mix though. Changing out all the rigging with the engine is usually required when we go from one brand to another, or when you change from control cables to fly-by-wire controls. Or sometimes people just want to change out the rigging as well, that way they get a warranty on the rigging as well as the engine when they do a repower. If you just change out the engine, the warranty won't cover your old rigging components. But that's just a little side note. Now like we said, there can be a huge variable here in the time that it takes to change out all the rigging, depending on what you get done and who does it. If we're talking about just hanging and banging the job, then you can swap out all the old rigging in a matter of about 2 to 4 hours. But that's just ripping out all the old rigging and then just pulling the new stuff in, hooking it up and letting it all just lay in the boat, where nothing has tension relief, maybe a couple of zip ties get used, and all the rigging is just left hanging in the helm. Yes, everything is going to be functional, but it's going to be more of the sloppy type of an install. You also have to account for the fabrication of other items when they are needed, most commonly like the control box hole. When replacing the old control box with a new control box, 50% of the time the old hole is larger than the new one, so we'll need to make a starboard plate or something to cover up the old hole, which is going to add another hour to the process. Then if we're talking about having issues with running the rigging as well, this can go from a 15-minute job to up to a 2-hour job. Many of you have seen the rigging tubes that are inside of boats. They are usually stuffed to the brink with all kinds of stuff, and pulling anything in or out of them can be a real hassle, to the point sometimes where we have to disconnect and pull out other things, like pulling out the larger items such as battery cables or fuel lines that take up a lot of space and don't have a pinned plug on the end of them, which allows us to get the old rigging out and the new rigging back in. Then we can pull those cables and hoses back through the rigging, giving us another 2-hour variable here. Then when it gets to the inside and making everything look pretty with all the new rigging ran in the boat, then you can find anywhere from another 2 hours of laying all the components out. Sometimes you have to make things like a backing plate to screw all the components to, and then get all the zip ties in to keep everything strapped in place, so it won't be bouncing all over when the boat is running, putting stress on the different components that allow your engine to function, usually called tension relief. This means that your rigging for a single engine, single station system can range anywhere from 2 to 3 hours all the way up to 8 hours in your worst case scenario. But the good thing about the rigging is it doesn't add that much time when you are adding engines. You're still pulling the rigging through, just more of it, and you are still mounting everything in the console, just adding the extra component for each engine. So it doesn't really add a ton of time to the rigging when we go from a single to a twin or a trip or even a quad engine setup. It's probably safe to say that it's just around another hour for the rigging per engine, maybe. And you can just add that hour per engine for your total time in the calculation for the price, making your worst case scenario for a quad engine single station rigging setup to take about 12 hours to install all of the rigging. Then what you can do if you've got a second station is just double that number. But these numbers are going to be a little more on the higher end of the spectrum though when it comes to the actual time spent. In my opinion though, I'd always rather account for the worst case scenario and allot enough time than come up short and run out of time. I'd much rather have someone tell me something is going to take 8 hours and cost $1,000 and it only take 4 hours and cost $500 than the other way around, or worse. There's nothing worse than someone quoting you $1,000 and then billing you twice that much. So just look at the high side of the hour mark as a decent reference point and be happy when it comes in less. Now when we add the two options together, you are looking at about 8 to 12 hours, with the worst case situation being around 16 hours for a single engine, single station repower. Then around 13 to 17 hours, with the worst case situation being 21 hours for the twin engine application, and 18 to 22 hours, with 26 hours being our worst case scenario for a triple engine setup. And then finally, 23 to 27 hours, with our worst case scenario being around 31 hours for a quad engine single station repower with all the rigging getting replaced. Now if we are going to add a second station onto the mix though, then we'll just double our middle number for each application. So our single is going to be about 12 hours, the twins are going to be about 18 hours, the trips come in around 24 hours, and the quad will end up being somewhere around 30 hours. Now remember, those are going to be for the average job, not the worst case scenario, and not the best case scenario either, because each boat is different and the space, fabrication, access is always going to vary from boat to boat. But that gives you a realistic idea of how long the install should take and allow you to get a good idea of what it is going to cost to do a repower on your boat. Now the third and final option for doing a repower is going to be where we throw in all the add-ons. This is where the wallet really hits home and where a lot of people lose sight of what their actual budget is until they start adding it all up. Because when we start talking about putting on some new engines and rigging onto the boat, it's not hard to start envisioning a bunch of other new stuff that we would like to have on the boat, and the wish list can get out of control pretty quickly. You might say, well, I'm getting new engines, so why not get a new stereo and some new speakers? Since my gauges and control box are new, let's go ahead and upgrade the electronics on the boat as well. You know, my VHF is really looking pretty old, and I could definitely use some more cup holders over here, another rod holder over there, and yeah, we definitely need to install a cooler slide back here under the leaning post, so you can see how it can get out of hand pretty quickly. When you are spending a lot of money on the new engines and rigging, it's easy to want to get carried away. So you want to keep in mind that these add-ons can range from a $1,000 stereo edition to a $6,000 GPS and transducer. So keep in mind what your actual budget is, what you really want to do, and be prepared to spend what you want to spend, because the add-on section isn't really a number of hours in labor. It can grow that price way above what you are expecting when we account for expensive electronics and the time that it takes to put all these additions onto the boat when you go to do the repower.